Hi, my name's Demara, and I'm going to be working with you today on this video to heal the shadow self and to give you processes, actually a really quick process to do over a period of time, which takes 20 minutes each time you do part of this processing. So it's not where we're going to say you need to go away for the next 6 months and work every day. This is something that starts to unfold and you start to see more and more why you react sometimes and why you can respond from who you really are other times. So this is Fast Track to Cosmic Consciousness number 5, because I've already been through 4 videos which were all part of an original podcast series which I'm now putting onto this YouTube channel. And this is really, really important to comprehend what is happening when you are not behaving the way that you would really want to behave if you were in mastery of yourself. And we've all had those incidences, haven't we? You know, I used to, when I was working with clients, I used to get them to name their shadow, because it then made them so much more aware when they were about to go into it. And the interesting thing here is you can tell by how you hold your body and the facial expression and also the tone of your voice, whether you've gone into shadow or not. And this is something I just started to realize when I was working on my own shadow, but also when I was with clients every day, like 6 to 8 clients a day, working with them in therapy, healing so that they could be who they really were and live that higher frequency life. And with my own, I used to call it the green gremlin. You know, it used to come out like I was, like I'm a Libran. I'm pretty well balanced on the whole. And I like to be balanced. I like to be calm, but happy, joyful, childlike as well, very much so, and always have. Not childish, childlike. So when I went into fear and went into tension within myself, that it wasn't safe to be me, then I would go into this other state, and I called it my green gremlin. So I was really aware when I was leaving my normal balanced self that could respond. I was now reacting. And I think it's quite a good idea to have a look at that and see who you think yours is, you know. And there are a lot of different shadows. Maybe I should go through that first. There's like the controller, there's the bully, there's the victim, there's the aggressor, there's the comedian, there's the performer. I mean, that's just a few. Mine was the green gremlin because it was so unlike what I really wanted to be. It's a really interesting subject because if you think about it, you know, our world is so mutated. Because what happens is you get a controller who meets a victim, whose shadow self is the victim. And they come together and they form this mutated so-called relationship. And there are many others, aren't there, you know, that come together and that people are not living through the joy of knowing who each other are. I mean, what is happening right now at this time when the frequency is raising is that we are meeting up with those that we really should be with and that we have a completely different relationship with. But that's not happening to everybody. But within the world, once you start to do the personal development and open up and start looking at yourself and wanting more for yourself and wanting to be able to give more to others, you realize how mutated the population is. And then you start becoming more of a hermit. That's what happened to me anyway. Because the more you know, the more you don't want to be around false people who are just playing out a scenario that they haven't healed. Goodness, we have something huge going on with this candle here. Doesn't look dangerous yet. I really don't know what it's going to do, but maybe we'll let it go for a bit longer. I might blow it out suddenly. But what we need to do is start to see what the root of that is. And the root of all of our shadow selves, because we're not born with a shadow in place. As far as I understand, we're not born that way, because I hear some people talk about, how evil some people are and they were just born that way. Well, if you've ever rebirthed people, and I've rebirthed a lot of people, which was a 3-hour process and which enabled them to come through even some of the harm that was caused to them and their pure self when they were in the womb. So we know that things happen in the womb. So if some child comes out and really has bad behavior from the beginning, then it could be that they had a severely damaged journey within the womb. So we can't even say that somebody is, but I don't believe it myself. And I've worked with thousands of people in all different ways and different levels of getting them to be able to come from a point and live from a point in themselves and love from that point as well. And be who they really are and who they really can be, and raise up how they live, how they behave, how they respond in life, and how much they can give to others, because that's what's really important for us. So years ago, when I started my journey, this is going back like 40 years now, when I'd seen, when I was in a really intense love relationship, what my green gremlin was capable of, when I actually kicked out at somebody who was trying to hold me back from the affection that we had been sharing over the previous couple of months. And it was a devastating thing that happened, and it really revealed, so it was very good for me because it revealed my shadow self in its entirety, which had never really come out like that before, where I could really see the horror of it, because this wasn't severely bad, but to me it was, because what happened was I kicked out at this person who was restraining me from coming any closer to them, because they had a certain way within their shadow, which was also pretty horrendous, because they could close down. They just needed a certain period of time, which they'd talk to me about as soon as we had a disagreement. This person actually told me that they were now going to not see me for 3 weeks. And I said, why? And they said, well, you will see. And what they were able to do, which completely shocked me and shocked obviously that part of me that was really intensely in this love relationship with them, that what would happen if somebody did that to me was my shadow would come out. So we taught each other. I don't know how much because I still haven't seen him for the last 40 years, but I don't know how much he healed and went into healing. I think not seriously did he consider that there was anything wrong with that process, but maybe in the future I will get to hear. But for me, it was like I need to look at this part of me that comes out, and it's out of control. It's not something that at the moment I could stop happening if I was in an intense situation like that. So I began looking, and 40 years ago there was some crazy theories and crazy stuff that used to come out. I remember reading that I'm trying to think how many times you had to say it. If you said things like, I forgive you, was it something like 70 times, 70 times? If you said it out loud or wrote it, you would have forgiven the person who you had discovered had caused you damage when you were as a child, like a father, a mother, a sibling, or maybe some stranger. and that would release this shadow that had formed. And I mean, those sorts of things do not work. So having gone through various things, I put together my own process, and this is a 20-minute written process, and it's very, very simple. But what you're doing is going to the core and asking yourself a question repetitively. There are a lot of processes like meditation using a mantra, for example, that work through repetition. And also like doing the awareness exercise, which is on the first Fast Track to Cosmic Consciousness video, where you just do that exercise 4 times every day, and you will change how your body is forming a pattern of a different higher level of awareness. And that's repetition. So in the same way, what we do with the processing is we bring in a process that's repetition for 20 minutes. And then if you don't get the result of a complete rising of the energy at that point, and you'll understand this when I give this process in a few moments, because I'm going to talk some more about how your shadow can be triggered and what that shadow is. The shadow is a trigger that happens, that has been put in place. Like your shadow is your survival person. It's the person that happened to enable you to survive the pain, the fear, whatever horror stories you have from your past. Because pretty well, you know, everybody has some stories about the damage that was caused to them when they were being brought up as a child. So that's where it mainly starts. And I must admit, if I go back to that, yes, this was triggered by a very deep love relationship when I really saw my shadow. But my shadow was there from when I was a child, because my father was quite an insecure, nervous man, but I didn't see it like that when I was little. I just saw that he was pretty terrifying. It used to go from one extreme to the other, actually. He could be jovial and quite sarcastic and wanting attention himself, and then go into this horrendous face and body actions of extreme anger. So I didn't see him as the nervous, sensitive person. Now, what I look at is what I really understood as I became a therapist and as I healed myself, and as I realized that he probably had the extreme sensitivity and empathy that I had and learnt to work with, and which is now, you know, the pleasure of my life, really, to be able to help people with those gifts. But he wasn't that man. He was born in 1926, and he just needed to go out there and went into the army when he was 17, actually, lied about his age at the end of the war. Or at the end, it would have been the end part of that. And then went into jobs that he really, in the beginning, didn't want to be doing, because he had to be that normal macho man. So his sensitivity never got a look in. He did end up, as his last job, as a personnel officer at a huge company in the town that I grew up, and was quite well known in the area. But he still did not ever. This is the interesting thing about shadows, isn't it? Because the person he showed when he was at work and working and helping people in need on the personnel side, what I found out, because people later on, as he got older and I went back to my hometown, they would tell me what an amazing man he was. And there were particular times where I could not even take that in as to what they were saying, because, and you know, on a couple of occasions with people that I trusted, I did say to them, do you know what? He was not that man at home. He was pretty horrendous. He was very hard to deal with, even through the latter years when I was helping him when he was elderly too. Threatening to kill me when I was in my 60s, actually. He threatened to put my face through a plate glass window is how he threatened me. That was the point at which, I just said, no, that's not happening. But he was still up for it even then. So the sad part about this is he never healed his shadow, which came out every time he felt threatened in some way. And he never worked that out. But at work, he was able to hold it together. At home, he never did. And that's sad, isn't it? That's a person who did not live out that life in the way that he could have done with his family. But it's just interesting when you start to look at this and people whose shadow is pretty horrendous. And if we go through history, we know that there are people out there who committed incredible crimes and who what it was their shadow self. I remember thinking about because I think I may have been already into therapy, but I already was a therapist. See, I was the one who sat by the fire in the kitchen. We had this like boiler that we all sat around in the evening. I mean, this is going back even before television days, which may seem crazy to my younger listeners. But my mother was always sad and unhappy about my father and about how he lived his life outside the family and inside the family. So she was always crying over this stove. We used to sit there for warmth. And I was her therapist then. I was like 10, 11, 12. Somehow I had this empathy that, and for a while, with this shadow self, it's quite interesting because my mother was a victim. She was playing out the victim. I was playing out the empath. And for ages, I saw that my father was the huge problem. I mean, as I got older, probably 13 or 14, I started to see that they were both as bad as one another. And they both had their shadow selves, which worked really badly together, and quite frightening for me as a child. But this is all about shadow selves. This is all about not being your balanced self with a higher aspect of what is happening, rather than going into that anger to be able to have that balance. So when you look at the extremes, I was probably latched onto the Hungerford murderer. Wasn't he the Hungerford shooter or something? He was famous in England. And I can't remember how old I was when he took revenge. But it was really interesting, I thought, when I read in the newspapers that they said he was this quiet man who you never thought would do anything. And haven't there been so many of them? These quiet people who they say, no, it couldn't possibly be him. I think, I'm trying to think of the other huge serial killer in England. I can't remember his name now. I've got a picture of him in my mind. But his wife had no idea. So he played a completely different role with his wife. But he murdered, I think, 9 or 10 young women. And he's still in prison now, I think. But what it would have been, if you would have gone into their history, and this is what I realised, because I was living it at home, and I was also living it through my own shadow, but I didn't know it at the time. I was very quiet. And if anybody spoke to me about anything emotional, I used to go silent. I mean, I remember one really bad, violent episode in my house against my sister. And I just didn't speak for 3 days after that because it was just too much for me to hear what was going on and the potential violence that went on in retribution as well. So my shadow developed as, this person who was very shy and didn't talk. And that wasn't natural for me at all. I mean, as I grew older, I was always the person who wanted to communicate with people. But it didn't happen until I got away from the family. When I was 20, I got married and moved away. And that's when I started to be able to safely be who I was. Because I was with a partner who had the same sort of family life as I did. Very unhappy, and I think that's why we married and went off together for 10 years, which was potentially good actually for both of us, but not the end of the journey for either of us either. But So looking at this, you can probably start to identify now. If you're listening still on this video, then you can probably begin to identify, what are you playing out? Did you go for being the controller or the victim? Did you go for being the bully? Did you go for being the comedian? Because my goodness, I've met a few of those, and yeah, it's fun for a while, but when people just crack jokes because they can't cope with the reality of life, it does get really boring and really strange as well, actually. The more you unfold your own real self, the more you're aware of who's in shadow around you. That's the thing. It's a real eye-opening experience. And I think that's why a lot of people who, when they do a lot of work on themselves, they have a very small group of people around them because they can see through what is going on. And also they don't want to be a part of reactionary situations. That's the other thing here. What I'm going to do is go through with you of how to start attempting this, because usually, like I started saying there's usually one person. Like for me, it was my father was the ogre for quite a few years, and then I realized they both were, because my father shouted and screamed and was horrendous in that way, arrogant and angry, but my mother was physically violent. So as I accepted that, I realized that what we did, when we're in this situation as children, is we choose the safer one for us. And for me, it was my mother, who was physically violent, but not so screamy and arrogant and on fire with anger as my father was. But then you realize that you need to heal both. So what the first thing is to do is to think about who you see as the big aggressor in the family who may have damaged you. And then you can start the process. And what you need to do is have quality time. You need 20 minutes quality time where you are not going to be disturbed, and you turn your phone off and you do not sit in a room with a television on or anybody else in that room. And what you start with is you're going to be writing, like I'll tell you what I would have written for me. The words I would have written is, what I, Linda, felt about my father when I was a child was. And then you just speak or you write the first word that comes off the top of your head. You don't think about it, because if we think about it, what we remember is the story we've told ourselves and how we've adapted it over the years. What also happens is you can also tell the story other people have told you. So what we're trying to do here by this process, and it works, I've used it with thousands of people over the years who were my clients and in workshops. So what I, Linda, felt about my father when I was a child was, write the first word that comes off the top of your head. And then you write the sentence again. What I, Linda, felt about my father when I was a child was. And don't pause in between. Keep going for 20 minutes. It feels like an age the first time you do it. I'm going to warn you of that. But it's so worth it, because you're going to be, what you're doing when you get the first word off the top of your head randomly is it's coming from your subconscious. So we're shaking around the control that the subconscious has when it's protecting you, because that's who protects you and forms the shadow, so that you survive. Some don't survive. Think about that. Some children die in childhood because of the abuse, and sometimes it's emotional and verbal, and they just weaken and weaken and weaken, and they are mentally ill, and some pass away because there's no nourishment for their soul, for who they are. So we survived. So what we're looking at is shaking around the subconscious. So you carry on doing it for 20 minutes. If you come up with blanks, that's fine. Just go quickly on and write the statement again. But when you're writing that statement, be at one with what you're saying. So you say the words silently to yourself as you write them. And the reason you must put your name in is that you are owning it. You're taking responsibility. If you just say, what I felt about my father when I was a child is it's so detached from you, and it can be. And we're trying to ignite with the trauma, aren't we? And this doesn't end up in a huge traumatic processing, because even when you've done it maybe one day, and you're really interested to look back over the words that came up, because some of them you didn't even realize had anything to do with you. But what you'll be interested in is, as you do this 2 or 3 times, and leave a day in between, do it every second day and take that 20-minute quality time. But what you'll realize when you're releasing is that you'll suddenly feel the energy rising, like from the pit of your diaphragm coming up. There's a pit of energy that starts, and it just starts rising, like when we're about to have a breakdown crying session and we didn't realize we felt that bad about something, something like that, or even a laughter session. That probably rises from the same place. But what you'll be aware of is that there's energy rising up, and what we need you to do is let that keep rising. And then when it's there with you at your throat, what you do is stop writing the sentence, and you just write and write and write. And when I got my release on this, when I was working with this and then went on to work with other people with it, but when I worked with it, I was writing all over that page, the horror of it all, the real feelings that I had never even really thought about. The fear, the horror, the loneliness, because I did feel totally alone as a child. No, there was nobody in the family. My sister and I didn't relate either until much, much later in our lives, because she was so totally different to me. And she doesn't remember much of any of this stuff that I remember and talk to her about in later years. But so there was a huge loneliness. But anyway, as you release, you don't write and write and write and forget that sentence until you get the energy rising, because then we know, and this was the most important thing I came upon when I was trying to work out how to do this, is that I needed contact with my inner child. And I had it when the energy rose. And it's the repetition that blocks the subconscious from blocking you. So that's what happens. With repetition, everything eventually goes into that lull and allows energy through. So it's like for meditation, as I spoke to you about, but also for this release. So having done my father, I would have gone on to do my mother. And you don't do the mother and father in like the same sessions or the same day or anything like that, because it can get very confusing. What you would need to do is leave time in between. So you would finish your sessions with your mother, say, and then start on your father when you get the release. Or for some of my clients, it took 6 months of doing this at least 2 or 3 times a week, because they were so tightly choked up and we're living through the shadow. So the shadow, it took ages to get that repetition. Now that's in extreme cases. I have met people recently who started doing it and the release came the first time. And that was because they'd done work, they were starting to meditate, they were starting to look at their life in a more awake and aware way. And the release was there on the spot. And sometimes I could spot that in clients and say, listen, I think you're going to get that release right away. Sometimes we would get half of the release in my consulting room, because I would be talking to them and I would be touching that side of what happened. intuitively, and then the release would come. So this is how you do it. You then need to look at, because you'll feel so great afterwards. I remember when I had the release from, it was much harder for me, I'm just going to interrupt myself here, it was much harder for me to get the release on my father, because he was the one that when I was a small child I was terrified of. And then there was, on the other side of it, there was this sickly affection, like he liked me to comb his hair and wash his feet. There was this other side of it where he would lap up attention. So I had a really painfully corrupt relationship with him, really, and that took more. But so I had to go back to that and go back to that. And I probably started with my father, then went on to my mother because I couldn't get the big release with my father, and then I went back to my father. And that was very clear when that came through. The real rising of that energy and of it coming out. But when it happened to my mother, when I worked on the stuff with my mother, there was a real tension between us. I mean, she was, like I said, physically violent, when she used to lose her temper and lose her trust in being able to cope. I think that's what it was more, because of her life with my father. So she would attack me as the child that happened to be the one in her womb when she found out that my father was unfaithful. So there was a lot of stuff here piled on top for my shadow to cope with, because I was actually in her womb when she went through this horrendous situation where she found out that he had been unfaithful to her, and she had so much resentment about that. So when I had released, my daughter used to go round to her house, and she used to look after her for a few hours, one day a week, because my daughter was the last one to be born, and I was already a single parent then when she was a year old. She would look after her. And when I went round this day, it was really interesting, because I knew I'd changed. I knew that when she battered that conversation to me, there was no way I was going to be able to bat it back in the same way. This unconscious communication that you have with people where there's trauma attached to it. And it was really interesting, because I dropped her off, and she started this really, it was like resentful and hateful conversation. And I can't remember whether she was just insulting me. I can't really remember, but I know that I just looked at her and really looked her in the eyes, and with no aggression at all, I said, "Mum, do you know, I don't want to carry on with this conversation. I really don't want to hear this ever again." And she just kept her eyes on my eyes, and she just burst into tears, which was an incredible thing to happen, because all I'd done was put my boundary in, and something happened to her. I mean, I knew something had happened to me. I knew that I'd had the release the night before, and that this day I was going round. And she just sobbed. And she said to me, "And you won't bring her around again for me to look after, will you?" And I said, "Of course I will. I'll be around next Wednesday." It was every Wednesday. I will be, because that's the level of healing you get. Now, we never spoke about that, but she never spoke to me like that ever again, or that sort of conversation, full of resentment and anger. And to me, any amount of times I did that 20-minute exercise was worth it for what I lived out for the rest of her life. I mean, I was the one who was called in to help when my father couldn't cope, when my mother got ill during her 80s, and I was the one that used to bath her and everything. Now, this was the woman that used to attack me physically, but the level of healing that had happened between us, because I did the releasing, it also released her, which is a crazy thing, isn't it? But this is the power of this technique that I've just taught you how to do. So what I would suggest is that you make a time, if you know you had a traumatic childhood and that you're still going into reaction, reenacting the past, remember what that word is. Responding is responding in the moment. When you react, like I did when I kicked out at this guy that I was in a relationship with or had been, it was a total response from my trauma, my own trauma, and how I was treated. So if you want to heal that, you need to make space for 20 minutes. And as I said, do it 2 or 3 times. If you don't get the release the first time, do it 2 or 3 times a week, not every day. And then start to think about the other people. Like for some people, there's teachers, there's coaches, athletic coaches who really torture their people that they're supposed to be teaching. You know, they're torturing them with their control and all of this. There's many people in our lives that have an effect on us. A past ex that you might have lived with as a victim for 20 years before you got away, you know, you need to release on it. Because what you're dealing with is that if you are a shadow, you can only attract a shadow. What's happening right now, and I've touched on this a little bit, and I'm going to do another video on the whole twin flame thing as I see it now and experience it. But the whole thing about this is you cannot come into alignment with a deep soul relationship until you have healed your shadow self. So this is a really good reason, if you're a person who's always looked for that real love, that real partner, where you can live your lives in awareness and wonder and beauty, because that's what you are to each other, then you need to heal the shadow self. So I hope this has helped. And if you want to ask me questions, please put them in the comments. And I would love it if you subscribe and you think this is useful to you, or give us a thumbs up on this video, because it helps me with the algorithm. That means that more and more people can share in this information. And thank you for allowing me into your space today. Thank you.